Joe Kent is here. Joe, you're running for Congress in Washington's 3rd district. Am I correct on that? Against Jamie
Yep,
Herrera Butler. Okay.
that's right. Yep,
Both Republicans, but you call her a rhino and you are an America First Republican. That's how you call yourself, right?
that's right. Yeah,
Okay. The reason I think somebody suggested bringing you on, and the reason I was interested in talking to you is because it seems like you've had some issues that maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, I'm not quite sure. I know the censorship will look different. Obviously, mainstream news does their own horse race depending on who they like and don't like. But now we have this whole new world of trying to campaign on social media. The problem though is that if your platform and message goes against community guidelines, now are you at a disadvantage from your opponents who are, may have a more mainstream platform. So that's the first thing I want to ask you about. What has it been like for you, and could you give us a couple examples of censorship that you've experienced as you've been campaigning online?
yeah. So it's interesting, and it's definitely a cool topic to talk about because I think a couple of years ago, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, I don't know if primarying an incumbent would be as possible as it is right now. I'm still very much the underdog going against an establishment candidate, but because of tools like social media and then really the Trump movement, the fact that President Trump was an insurgent from the right, and he still remains that way in many ways. And there's an interesting civil war going on right now, I'm sure we'll talk about within the Republican Party between America First and your traditional establishment Republican types. But really, without social media, I don't know how we would be able to, crack through the corporate media. I've been very fortunate to be on Fox News, thanks to Tucker Carlson and a few other hosts that have had me on there. But really, that's been my only bit of what I would consider to be mainstream, if you can, consider Tucker Carlson and those guys mainstream. Breakthrough, but really everything else has been entirely social media, podcasts, independent journalists, and I really think that helps us level the field. The problem is that the technocrats have so much control over these platforms that I've faced some censorship. Most recently, I got a Twitter suspension, which I'm sure we can talk about, and then same thing with YouTube. A suspension. I was supposed to be permanently kicked off YouTube, but we contested it and kind of raised a stink about it and got our account reinstated. But it's kind of one of those things that, any minute you could be taken off the internet, and that really disadvantages, insurgent candidates, or really any political candidate. But yeah, so it's definitely been, it's a double-edged sword.
What were the reasons, or like in that instance you're talking about where you were supposed to be permanently banned from YouTube, what were you talking about that was so offensive?
So what's interesting is it wasn't that I was talking about anything interesting. I was talking to a canceled person. I frequently
Right.
appear on Steve Bannon's War Room, and
Yeah.
Steve Bannon himself is persona non grata on YouTube. So simply being on camera with Steve Bannon was what they said was contrary to their community guidelines. So myself and a few others were kicked off within the same 24, 48-hour period for the exact same reason. Like I said, they eventually reinstated our accounts, but they didn't even say that I had specifically said anything wrong. It was just that I appeared with someone who was not suitable for, that section of the internet.
Interesting. It does seem like that has encroached from just what one talks about to who one associates with. And I've said many times, I think that's deliberate and really manipulative and dangerous because it sort of escalates that self-censorship to self-isolation. And
Yeah.
you could say whatever you want about Bannon or really anybody else that's been blacklisted by YouTube or the tech companies. But that sends a signal, I think, that we should be held accountable for the reputation or the thoughts of other people around us. And I think that's intentional to keep people from associating, not just
Yeah.
publicly, but even maybe behind the scenes. Like you never hear another person's ideas, and then I don't know, just find out that like maybe they aren't exactly what the mainstream has said about them. And that, you could use somebody like a Bannon or an Alex Jones and sneak it in pretty easily, but then it starts to creep closer and closer and closer to, to people that you're like, wait, what? That person's now on the
Right.
I feel like it's a deliberate move to keep people from associating with folks who they may not actually be natural enemies of, you know, but it's created, it's like this created division, and you don't have to divide people anymore because they will divide themselves because they're too scared to associate anymore.
That's right. I mean, it's a complete control measure. I mean, not only do they want to control ideas, but they want to control who interacts with who to make you so scared of some person themselves that you don't, go on their podcast or go on their platform, and then that extrapolates into real life. Like, now, are you going to go and have a real life interaction with that person? I mean, I really feel this is the technocrats wanting to control not just the narrative, but who associates with each other. And really, like you said, they don't want us to interact with each other in a long form, real conversation format, which is what I think a lot of this unconventional media, what we're doing right here, having a real conversation, that's really cut through the control that the corporate media had for the past several decades, really, or as long as there's been media. It was either in printed form in newspapers or magazines, or it was cut down into these 2-minute talking points on the cable news media. But this podcast form, it's a real threat to people that want to control ideas and control associations.
Mm-hmm. So besides that Bannon instance, I know I know you've talked about at the very least Jamie Herrera Butler's vote to impeach President Trump. And so I'm curious, like, have you been censored over talking about the impeachment or January 6th or COVID or anything else?
COVID and the election in particular. January 6th has gotten me, labeled a couple different things here and there, insurrectionist and terrorist and all that. I've gotten specific warnings about discussing COVID policy. I led a rally up at the Board of Health against the forced quarantine, Washington State administrative codes, and then a few other times too. And so that's gotten me strikes. And then same thing with talking about election fraud, election discrepancies. That's also gotten me some strikes and some warnings from YouTube and from Twitter.
What do you think about being someone who could potentially be elected, but your message is hidden in part from the electorate? It seems like let's argue devil's advocate. I don't like your platform. I don't want
Sure.
you in office. Wouldn't it behoove the powers that be to show me every crazy thing that you say so that I know for sure I don't want to vote you? Doesn't it actually help the people who might, otherwise say, oh, I don't know, that Joe guy, he's a little bit out there for me. It would help them vote for you if the crazy stuff someone says is blocked. So it doesn't make any sense to me, like from that perspective. Like, it would seem like you would want people to just see Joe in all his glory, instead of hiding the things that you're the most concerned about that actually could be exactly what would sort of maybe work in your favor in the long term. So I've always found that to be odd too.
It's very weird. I think where some of my more what people would define as controversial takes, I want them to have the utmost exposure, and I want to have rigorous discussions about them and arguments about them. I think especially with the way that we're seeing the veil lifted on everything that is the COVID narrative. Imagine if we would have had some of these more robust, uncensored discussions a year ago, and all the people that were canceled and kicked off mainstream media. Like, turns out they had a lot of validity to their arguments. And so, yeah, I think especially in terms of when people are running for public office, if you think they're crazy, if you think they're horrible people, those are the exact types of people that we need to give platforms to, so that we can listen to them, we can have discussions and debates about what their ideas are. So for me, the people I'm going against, like Jamie Herrera Butler and a lot of what the far left is doing, I want them to have the utmost exposure. I don't want them to be able to hide behind their relationship they have with the corporate media or their millions of dollars they're getting from special interest groups. I love the idea of having debates with them or really grilling them on their ideas.
Before we get to the rest of this video, this is just a short clip that has basically been sanitized so it can fly under the radar on YouTube. If you want to see the entire conversation that we had or the entirety of the commentary that you're watching, please go to one of my other platforms. One of the best places to go is AllisonMorrow.locals.com, where you can become part of my editorial board and pose questions ahead of time for interviews. I also do live editorial board meetings on Saturdays. You can bring your feedback and pose ideas for guests and topics for the week to come, and you get exclusive content. So go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com, but whatever you do, don't stay here on YouTube. If you want the full truth about what's happening around us, you gotta go somewhere else. So you're a former Green Beret, correct?
Yep, that's right.
And your wife, your Gold Star husband, your wife was killed by a suicide bomber in Syria in 2018, if I have the date correct.
2019, January
2019.
2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and if I was watching your video and that was, it was like really close to the time where Trump was discussing withdrawing as well, right? So you've talked a lot about, I know you're very big on ending America's endless wars and discussing nation building, and I think that's become more and more prominent among, and you can explain this better for me maybe, but what you were talking about, that division in the Republican Party, I'm not really quite sure what you would call that side of the Republican Party. Maybe it's what you call yourself. But can you tell me a little bit about that and how has that been perceived among, I guess the party itself?
Yeah, it's huge. So my late wife was killed a month after Trump attempted to get our troops out of Syria the first time. So we destroyed all the ground that ISIS controlled in Syria by December of 2018. Trump gave the order. He wanted the troops out of Syria by Christmas Eve of 2018. My wife had orders to get out of there then. That's when Secretary of Defense General Mattis publicly resigned. A bunch of other unelected bureaucrats publicly resigned. Ran to the media, said that Trump was going to end the world because he was trying to end a war. And the result was our troops remained deployed. A month later, my wife and 3 other Americans were killed by a suicide bomber. So I had been a strong supporter of President Trump's foreign policy before that, and that really only showed me exactly, how right President Trump had been and how dedicated the deep state, the national security blob, whatever you want to call them, how determined they were to keep us at war no matter what. And so I think this is a very clear distinction between America First Republicans, which is what I call myself, and traditional Republicans. Traditional Republicans have bought off on the foreign policy doctrine of the Bush era. There's many of them that will say that, yeah, okay, maybe the Iraq war was wrong, but these are the same types of people that are saying that we need to rush off to our next war with Ukraine or potentially go back into Afghanistan. So I think this is a huge distinction. President Trump really flipped the GOP on its head and said, hey, we've gotten nothing from these endless wars, and we don't need to be at war everywhere. We have other tools. He didn't hesitate when it came time for us to use decisive force, but he did so without getting us into any additional wars. So really a true foreign policy of restraint. And that's something that I think had been discussed in theory before. We saw a little bit of it during the Cold War, but really in a post-Cold War era, a great way to navigate a complex world where you have terrorist threats, you have threats from countries like Russia, countries like China. You simply can't be at war everywhere. But what you can do is you can use the full scope of U.S. power with our strong independent economy as the backbone. And that's a real difference. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that play out right now with this Ukraine issue. And we saw a lot of it with Afghanistan as well. So I think this is pretty clear that the corporate GOP still very, very much wants a return to the old neoconservative ways where there's always some war somewhere for us to fight. Because really, it's good for the military industrial complex and the corporate donor class.
So that brings me to something I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about, because I got some questions about this and wanted to throw it your way. Um, so I've been reading about the funding behind the whatever this they're calling it military restraint movement. So I don't know if that's what you call it, but you see articles like this that Charles Koch cultivates anti-war image and Koch Industries profits from defense contracts and is teamed up with George Soros on this with I think they both donated something like 500,000 to this Quincy Institute, I guess is I'm just go through it real fast just because I'm just curious because a lot of people go, oh, the Koch brothers or George Soros, and now they're together and what's going on? Like what's happening behind the scenes, and why would somebody who makes money off defense contracting would this be a genuine effort, or is there something else going on here? And so because I get questions like this, I'm just curious, could you respond to the concerns that some people have about the genuine nature of this messaging? Because you're talking about the corporate GOP versus what you're discussing, but I think some people might question, is there still influence there and still confluence between those two?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's still corporate influence. I mean, this is politics in DC. Where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the perspective of somebody who fought these wars for 20 plus years, lost countless friends, lost my late wife to them. Had a front row seat for the war on terror, all the way from being, a guy on the ground soldier to working in the intelligence community, trying to actually give ground truth to policymakers, and just seeing that massive disconnect. So for me, this comes from a place of experience. I've worked a little bit prior to running for office with Concerned Veterans for America, which I think did take some Koch brothers funding. I get it, but in order to actually get a seat at the table in Washington, D.C., a lot of times you need to be able to get your message out there. I don't know exactly the details between CVA and the Koch brothers, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that dark money at play. I mean, really for me though, the simple fact that this never-ending war, nation building, and then regime change wars, they simply just haven't worked for us. I'm a very pragmatic guy, and I do believe that we need to have a robust national security state that's actually looking out for our country. The problem is these failed neoconservative ideas, they just haven't worked. I mean, I wish I could say they did, because I fought in these neoconservative wars. I wish I could come back and beat my chest and say, this is what me and my friends accomplished in our great war, like our grandparents did after World War II. But I just simply can't do that. So I advocate for a foreign policy of realism and restraint from a place of personal expertise.
I wanted to ask you about how much your wife's death influenced your decision to run. I do want to say I'm terribly sorry about. I can't even imagine. It's obviously not even been that long, and you have 2 kids. So as a mother, it really is. It's just so sad. So I just want you to know that I feel really terrible about that. And I'm just curious, you are left raising 2 boys, right? You guys had, right? You have 2 sons. And so, there are, I'm sure, a lot of different directions that your life could have gone. Why run for Congress? And, how much of your wife's death influenced your decision to do that?
So, I mean, a lot of it really did. I had started a second career before my wife was killed. I had started a second career in the CIA as a paramilitary operations officer. I felt it was my calling, just because of my experience, to stay kind of in the shadows, but fighting our nation's wars. We always need people to go fight these wars. I wanted to fight smart wars and not dumb wars, but I felt that was my life calling. After she was killed, I was actually overseas as well, not in Syria, but somewhere else when she was killed. And so I realized I had to step away from essentially putting myself in harm's way to take care of our children. I really intended on just coming back here to the Pacific Northwest, raising my kids, and kind of putting a lot of government service behind me. I had a real unique opportunity to meet President Trump, and I just told him, like, hey, I've been fighting these wars my entire adult life, and you're getting the policy right, but you're being undermined at the most senior, almost down to the junior mid levels, really, within the Department of Defense and within the intelligence community. I just told him that because, frankly, I didn't have anything to lose. I was resigning, and I thought that was going to be like my cash out moment. I at least got to tell the man who I supported so strongly how I felt. And I didn't think much of it. And then about a week later, he reached back out, through intermediaries, of course, and said, hey, I want to hear more of what you have to say. And so I wrote some white papers for the Trump administration, did some advisory work, worked on the Trump 2020 campaign, but really wanted to put a lot of credibility behind the America First foreign policy, everything we just discussed, and got an invitation, got a job offer to go work in the second Trump administration National Security Council. So I said, hey, if I'm being called to serve again and these guys think I can help out, I will go do that, because I believe strongly in this revolution that we're having within the Republican Party. But then the election went the way that it did, and the results of 2020, the COVID lockdowns, and just seeing the direction our country was heading in, I felt that I was on the cusp of really losing our country and everything that my wife fought and died for. And so really having the legacy of her losing her life and having to explain to my kids someday that this is the country that she gave her life for, like right now, I just don't feel like I can do that. So for me, it really all ties into her sacrifice and the sacrifice of so many others throughout the years. That's why I'm doing this.
So I'm so curious, another thing I've noticed about Republicans, or maybe just conservatives, is that it used to be kind of back the blue no matter who, and now you're starting to see more and more skepticism of especially federal law enforcement agencies, FBI, CIA, especially after like just speculation over what really happened on January 6th. I've never seen that before among conservatives who are like now aligned with, some groups on the left to say, what's going on with, especially, like I said, federal law enforcement, maybe not necessarily local as much, but I'm curious what your thoughts are, since that's your background. You're focusing on, obviously you've talked a lot about, ending the wars and stuff. What do you think about those agencies at this point? And I'm just curious, does that play into your, like, would there be any policies, I guess, that you would work on if you were elected that are related to that, since you have connections there?
Yeah, so coming from the intelligence community, I strongly believe that we need a robust intelligence community that's going to look out for the safety of America. But this looking internal, this bringing the war on terror home, that really started, in the post 9/11 era with the Patriot Act, and really just amplified more and more. It's completely and totally out of control. And this is really just human nature. If you continue to give people power, it will go to a dark place. I mean, anybody reading history understands this. And this is what's happened with our intelligence community, unfortunately. I think a lot of the weaponization of the intelligence community, obviously, it started with the Bush era with the Patriot Act, but then Obama took it to the next level. I think what happened with Russiagate, with the abuse of FISA being turned against political operatives, it set the template. And then we're on the slippery slope of like, hey, the federal government, the FBI, has been involved in really setting people up to commit these crimes for a political end. What we saw with Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, there's like 12 federal agents that were part of that plot that really facilitated the entire thing. And then January 6th, initially when I saw January 6th, what happened, I was appalled that there was a big riot. It disrupted a constitutional process that I was closely watching, that I thought was critical for really the security of our elections to take place. But then the more evidence that comes out, I mean, I recognize intelligence operations when I see them, and this has all the hallmarks of an intelligence operation. And there's a reason why the government isn't being forthcoming on a lot of these different relationships. And so I personally, from the position of a congressman, I want to use the tools of oversight to go through and improve the American people, lay it all out for them. What happened exactly on January 6th? What role did the government plan to go in the riot? Because right now it looks like they definitely had some degree of a role. I have my own theories based on what I've seen so far, but that needs to be laid out for the American people. Because at the end of the day, if we the people are going to continue to give these powerful institutions so much power over us, they have to be accountable to us, and that really starts with congressional oversight.
Before we get to the rest of this video, don't forget you can support my work with two great gift options. The first option is AllisonWinePromo.com. That's Allison with 1L winepromo.com. You get 50% off some of my favorite Malbecs from the high altitude regions of Argentina, and 50% off shipping. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. But if you'd rather toast to free speech with a hot cup of coffee, or actually a cold cup of Katura tea, which is tea made out of the coffee fruits, go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. These are high altitude, shade grown, USDA certified roasts from Nicaragua. The owner and founder of the company even lives there, right where they grow, roast, and harvest. So check out both of my sponsors, AllisonWinePromo.com and twinenginecoffee.com/Allison.